Sure. So before we proceed with the rest of the day, we do want to recognize that we are on the unceded indigenous lands of the Abenaki and Wabanaki Confederacy, including the Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Maliseet, and Micmac peoples. We acknowledge the harms of settler colonialism and the responsibility that groups like this network bear to foster relationships and opportunities that strengthen the well-being of indigenous peoples, including identifying cultural shifts within research teams and institutions needed to better respect indigenous knowledge. So we're thrilled to have panelists joining us from both the eastern and western sides of our continent to share their insights and stories of community engagement. And I'll turn it over now to Veazy, who will introduce herself and then bring the panelists. Thanks.
Thank you, Kathy. If anybody asks you to moderate a panel, you immediately say yes in the hopes that you can take your mask off. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here today, and thank you for the energy that both Holly and Kathy bring to this organization. My name is Veazy. I am the director of the UMaine Portland Gateway, which is an initiative to help connect the University of Maine to things that are happening in southern Maine. We are going to talk about stories of community engagement, and this is this moment that we all get to be together right now. So I'm inviting you to put down phones, to just kind of be present in this moment and to listen to the stories that people are going to tell. So first I'd like each of the panelists to introduce themselves first, and then we'll go back to the first group, which Darren Renko is kind of leading, and hear some perspectives from each of our panelists. So I'm going to turn this over to Darren. I see Darren there. Good morning, Darren.
Awesome, thanks, Pips. I'm Darren Renko. I'm chair of Native American Programs and associate professor of anthropology at the University of Maine. I'm also a Penobscot Nation citizen, and we've been doing, since I returned to Maine in 2009, really trying to build the right and proper relationships for research between the University of Maine and our Indigenous nations. So I'll hand it over to Bridie, who will go next.
Thanks, Darren. Hi, everyone. I'm Bridie McGreevy. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Communication and Journalism at the University of Maine. And I'm also very involved in the Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions, which is where I had the great honor and privilege of being able to work with Darren many years ago and learning how to do this work in engaged research partnerships with largely representatives from natural resource departments in Wabanaki tribal nations, including the Penobscot Nation and the Holton Band of Maliseet Indians more recently. And I'm very happy to be here. And I will turn it over to Jan.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jan Paul, Penobscot citizen, mother, daughter, aunt, many aunts over time. I was even an aunt before I was born. Anyway, coming from a large family, I've lived here all my life, and it's good to see everyone and be here. And I'm here to learn as well as share, and I hope to get to know people better. Angie?
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. My name is Angie Reed, and I have worked as the water resources planner and worked with and spent many, many hours of my life with Jan since 2004. So we have lots of fun stories to share and many stories, Darren and Bridie. So I'm really excited to be here. Thanks.
Pips will hand it over to Terzah, maybe.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thanks, Darren. Okay, and I will hand it over to Terzah next.
I am a Nupiaq, and my family's home village is Utiavik. And my professional background is not primarily academic. I have worked in government in environmental conservation for Indigenous NGOs, governance of environmental NGOs, and large-scale resource development projects with international corporations, primarily in the Americas and Europe. And in that capacity, I did lead research, socioeconomic baseline studies in many different countries, mostly around vulnerable and Indigenous communities. I currently am a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, working on environmental justice and the energy transition, especially as it impacts Indigenous and vulnerable communities. So a hodgepodge background there. I do lecture and teach at Harvard and other institutions. And I'm really happy to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Terzah. And finally, we have Diane, who you've met, but I want to offer Diane the opportunity to say anything that you'd like in the context of this panel.
Right, so in my other life, I am right now the interim director of the Institute of Social and Economic Research at the University of Alaska, Anchorage, and I'm a professor of education policy. My research is both on, I look at Indigenous education and circumpolar education issues in Alaska and beyond. And then I've transitioned to a lot of work around education and knowledge sharing in enabling communities to enact their self-determined sustainable development goals. And in particular, I'm working on projects around building energy, sustainability, and sovereignty in remote and rural Indigenous communities in partnership with friends at the Alaska Center for Energy and Power. And then you've heard the rest of my hats.
Okay, thanks, Diane. So let's dive into the meat of what we're going to do today, and I'm going to pass it to Darren and his team to talk about stories and the collaborative work that they are doing.
I do, just because there are many people who we've been working with who aren't here. I am going to share just a couple of slides. Just bear with me. I know we're sharing stories and all that. But partly because of my inability to be creative, but it also helps, it'll help my team remember the stories we wanted to share, because we have so many. This notion of science and in Indigenous homelands is critical to the way we work, that the university is the guest, the researcher is the guest in Indigenous territory. And that's how we encounter our work. And I think that's very important. This titling is coming from a paper that we were involved in that got published in Sustainability Science earlier this year, which we'll be happy to share, because some of the frames we're going to use for our stories are in that. But I do want to say, like, in addition to the four of us, these people and many, many more have been a critical part of our collaboration. And you'll notice that it's mostly Indigenous people, and there's a lot of future leaders, undergrad and graduate students, in the way we do our work. So next generation thinking as we mobilize this research is critical to our frames. We work through a variety of methods and questions, and thinking about how power and decision-making works together, both through research and the policy implications of our research. We tend to time in really specific ways, scheduling and frameworks of time in production. On whose terms those are is a very important question for us. And hopefully it's again on Indigenous clocking systems or attention to time. And then what do we need to kind of bring in change for institutions that actually are more oriented towards thinking of themselves as guests in Indigenous homelands. And this is the penultimate slide to remind my team that we have really talked about how to build long-term relationships. What does that look like? What does that mean? One of the things that is a hiccup for researchers often is this notion of mutual benefit. Well-meaning, powerful people with lots of resources often think that if they go visit a place and start to include someone in the thing they're doing, that is enough, and that is simply just not even the way to begin a relationship. So thinking that through from the very first instant is important, and we'll relate to kind of experiences, sharing. What does that mean? Jan, who is always quotable in response to the power dynamics of getting students to see things differently. They built a relationship with the river, and that is what is most important. We'll share some of that story and then sort of broader lessons learned. And then I'll hand it over to Bridie to kind of talk through, shift us into a discussion based upon the tensions in praxis. And Bridie, let me know when I can get rid of the slide.
Yeah, I think you really covered a lot of this already in your setup, but we did want to just point to the paper that Darren mentioned. It is available, a pre-proof version is available online, I think on like one of those academia.edu sites. So feel free to check that out. It kind of goes into more depth about what we've learned about how science as a discourse and as a system of power has really been shaping our work, and how to push on that and some of the dominant logics and some the opportunities related to Wabanaki diplomacy and centering Indigenous methods, centering student leadership, Wabanaki student leadership in shaping the relationships and research designs. Darren briefly mentioned what we've learned about time and how attention to time has been really essential. And I think in engaged research, like it's pretty easy to recognize all of the kind of time pressures that we face in trying to do this work well, and how quote unquote time consuming that is. And so we're mindful about some of those practical issues related to time. But we've also recognized that like we're literally living time as an experience differently. And I think about Robin Wall Kimmerer, the way she describes this in her book, which I imagine many listeners are familiar with, of that maple drip time is different from alder drip time. And this idea of like time as ecological. And how like something for us, I'm thinking, Jan and Angie, of like how going out on the river is a different kind of time, in part because we have to get up at 4 a.m. to do these sampling runs, which is connected to that kind of, stewardship ethic that the Penobscot Nation has, and how that, requires that they live time differently. So those are some of the reflections that we have in that paper, and that we'll hopefully, speak more to today. But what we wanted to do is try to demonstrate one of the most important commitments that we found in this work, and that is in being in near constant dialogue with each other from the very beginning of how we've formed these relationships, and how stories have really circulated for us that in ways that have shaped our learning. So I can open it up with an initial story, and yes, Darren, thank you. And I'm always interested in the different stories that we tell about this work, but the one that comes to mind for me all the time is the story of the day that I met Angie and Jan, which was in the Mitchell Center, which is a really important space for Darren and I. A lot of learning has happened there. And it was in a presentation, a great presentation about dam removal, where the presenter had walked through all of the really important considerations related to dam removal of like, risk reduction and how dams are aging, and the cost benefit analysis with removing dams. And at the end of the presentation, I heard this voice from the back of the room, this really powerful voice saying something along the lines of, recognizing that we are in the homelands of the Penobscot Nation and in an island in the middle of the Penobscot River, how do you think about dam removal, the spiritual benefits of dam removal, and how dam removal is resistance to colonization? And I turned around and I thought, I really want to meet this person. Turns out it was Angie, and Jan was sitting next to her. And I made the mistake in that moment of thinking that Jan was the quiet one, which I've learned is not the case. Just Jan times her comments, and you need to be ready to listen when she's ready to speak. But from there, we exchanged contact information. I see it as one of the most important moments of my career, because everything has changed for me as a researcher and a teacher, and as somebody living in the homelands of the Penobscot Nation. And we've been in dialogue in many different contexts, whether it's just going out on a walk or getting dinner together, being out on the boat together, giving presentations together, and so on and so forth. And there's so much learning that has happened in that ongoing dialogue. So that's my first story. I'll open it up, see if we have other stories to share.
Yeah, I'd love to hear the other side of meeting, right? So we do a lot of humor through story and framing, and it's always difficult to sort of identify like Oh, what's the purpose of humor? Is that social regulation, or is it to actually just build community? Probably that and so many other things. So I want to just put a pin in that it is an important part of our engagement in terms of story and building community. I don't know, Jan, Angie, what are we missing? What's the key ingredient here in our framing? I always struggle. This is just my last part of the setup. I always struggle only because I asked Jan and Angie to do things that I know is not in their wheelhouse of what they are tasked to do every day, including this presentation. So I struggle with that all the time because I know, and I think this is part of the engagement. I know what they do every day. I mean, actually, Bridie probably more so than me now. But I spent a lot of time just hanging out in when I was writing my dissertation, even just hanging out in the building that houses their department and seeing what they do every day and seeing when they're out sampling and when they're not and how to navigate that. So I guess I just want to turn it over to them to be like, where are we going? What did we do right or wrong?
Well, I think what it just came to me, what we're doing is we're giving heart to science. That's what we're doing, is we're connecting our heart. And we know we're out of balance. Even in science, regular Western science, there's balance, right, to everything. We're out of balance as a whole. So I think us coming together as a people and talking and getting to know one another, we're putting heart to the science. Because they obviously just don't believe the science. We've got to give it something else.
Yeah, there's a perfect example of what Bridie said earlier. The times are comments. It's not always saying something, but you got to pay attention when it happens. That's one of those moments. One of my favorite quotes from Brene Brown actually was, maybe stories are just data with a soul. And I thought, yeah, I love data. I mean, I feel like a nerd sometimes, but a lot of what I do for Penobscot Nation is manage data. But yeah, Jan is right on. I guess I would just say we're doing right. We're building relationships, which I don't know if anybody else has a really perfect experience in building relationships, but it's messy. It's really messy and it's really uncomfortable sometimes. And I think part of a challenge is becoming comfortable with being uncomfortable and working your way through it. I certainly know yoga and meditation helps me immensely in realizing that things are going to be uncomfortable. And I think most people, especially in Western science, we're used to, if we don't know it all, often we think we do. And that's just not the case. And I love Darren's this as being a guest, science and researchers being a guest. I've said that to Jan ever since I've known her. It's like, I feel like one of the biggest challenges is we are a guest in York. We still act poorly, which is stunning. And that's not even just science. That's what so I think relationship building and figuring out how to speak to that power that Darren was talking about on the slides, that power is in this room right now. I think that's probably one of the most uncomfortable things. And especially if you have to speak to difficulties in a relationship that you're with somebody is even harder. So
Terzah, I'm going to turn it to you for some stories.
Okay. So first I want to say this, great kickoff. I've got a whole page of notes already, but this storytelling is data with a soul is brilliant. And I hope Angie will let me use that when I talk about the power of story. This is Tikyak, which is Point Hope in Alaska, one of my home villages on the edge of the Arctic Ocean, western edge of the Arctic Ocean. And these are whale bones which delineate our burial grounds in Tikyak. This is a site that has been continuously occupied for 14,000 years by my people. So as I like to tell Harvard and others when I'm asked to speak to often sustainability, I say, my people survived in an environment that would kill most of you in 12 hours. So why is that important? I think it's important because the knowledge accumulated in 14,000 years through story it's an overused term. I don't have a better one. Invaluable. It is the very definition of invaluable. And I know that the people on the panel that I'm sharing the screen with, Darren, Angie, Jan, Bridie, know how much weight that has in our communities and what it means to us, the value to us of our stories. The problem is communicating that value and what it means to us to people from outside. As we say in Alaska, and there are a few Alaskans in the group, I know there are, outside with a big O, mean out there. But I like to use this slide because I don't have a team with me. And I'm so glad that I'm on a great panel because that makes me feel less alone because we do things as a community. This is my community. And this is specifically a picture of my mother who's in the middle. This is UTIAVik when she was growing up, and she's with my aunties / her girlfriends as young women in UTIAVik. Behind them is the edge of the Arctic Ocean. To the right, the only structure that you see, the white building, is the Presbyterian Missionary Church, which came to civilize us. And so I am the first generation as an English speaker as first language. My mom's first language was Inupiaq. She learned English better when she was sent to boarding school, thousands of miles away. A good one though, apparently from an education standpoint, but that was never spoken of. The important thing beyond having my family stand beside me, which is why I live with this slide wherever I go in the world, is also the quote that I have associated with it, which you can read, but I will summarize. It's from a Yupik scholar, one of the first Yupik, if not the first Yupik PhD, Oscar, who I had the privilege of meeting. Yupik is south of Inupiaq country in Alaska. But the quote really is saying that Indigenous knowledge really and our stories can help all of you. It is reverse of the paradigm that says Western science will save us. I think that is being proved wrong in this moment that we're living. And so we have lessons and knowledge that perhaps might be helpful to people out there, people who are coming to do research, but coming and do research without the idea of co-creation of what the questions might be. I know we jumped to co-production. I think it's a great concept. I would say, in my experience, the most successful, and it's messy, as you guys were talking about earlier, this relationship building, which is foundational to doing work with people in communities. I'm just going to say it simply, Indigenous and vulnerable communities. You need to build that relationship. If we think about our own relationships, like husband and wife, or boyfriend and girlfriend, or I like to think of it in terms of maybe it's a committed relationship and you go through a dating stage. That takes a while. You build trust. Then you get engaged. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe you don't, right? Because we don't know. You get engaged. Okay, so another level of commitment. I'm there with you. And then comes the big part. You get married. Maybe, and I'm not saying you should get married. Whatever your convention is around long-term commitment. And that's what you're doing if you're coming to a community, if you really want to build relationships. And that time factor that was referred to earlier by Darren and Jan and Angie is absolutely key to this. The arc of time needed to do that does not respect your grant deadlines. Just here to tell you that. You can't just show up, as my elder and mentor, Al Adams, former Senator Al Adams from Kotzebue, a Inupiaq hub village just south of Inupiaq, taught me, don't be a UFO, right? And that's true of academic researchers, that's true of industry, that's true of governments, it's especially true of environmental NGOs who come in a UFO, get off, do something, say, we're here to help, always a red flag, build something, get back on their UFO and fly away. And we're left, and I'm lifting this, attribution goes to Al Adams. And we're left looking at as the UFO flies away and going, did we ask for that? What does it do? And more importantly, practically, how do we maintain that? You know, it's often something we don't even know the purpose of. And that, I always think of that. An example of this, I would say, would be Village Voice. This was back in the day when I was leading the efforts to do exploration in the Arctic Ocean for Royal Dutch Shell. That experience for me began in 2005 and extended over a number of years. And I negotiated the conflict avoidance agreements on behalf of Royal Dutch Shell with my home villages, the 8 villages of the North Slope borough of Alaska, the US Arctic. And in this process, I had to slow the roll, as we say, speaking of time, of Royal Dutch Shell and say, I'm sorry, you want to drill in 3 months. It's going to be 3 years. And it did not make me popular. Perhaps years later, it led to my ultimate demise because I kept saying that on other projects I worked on from Colombia to Greenland. Slow the roll. It's not going to happen. You're not going to have the social license to operate. And Village Voice was born out of the desire. I had a thought bubble one night, and then I tested it with my elders first, and then I took it around and got sign on from governments, industry, because at the time the Arctic project was involving multi-governments, many industry players, not just Shell, but Exxon and Conoco and BP, and of course, many indigenous communities would be impacted by drilling in the Arctic Ocean and trying to pull out some of the 90 billion barrels of oil that lies underneath that 150 feet of water, which also contains 50% of our food supply. So there was a tension there, if I could use a very under-descriptive word. So the answer was to show up and say, hey, why don't the elders and the youth, and it ends up after a year of bringing people together from all 8 villages, which our role, in this case being industry, was to sit on the sidelines. We weren't allowed to speak, and ask the people, the elders and the youth of the villages, how they saw development, how they saw moving forward, how would that look to them, what were there, and we were only there as a resource to answer possible, fundamental impacts of whatever it is we were proposing to do. It took a year for them to my villages, to even trust our intentions. It took a second year in which the people of Village Voice, the representatives from the communities, which were selected by the communities. So there wasn't a job description that went out. There wasn't somebody we identified as a leader. Nope, communities know who their people are. 3 years into Village Voice, when I left, it had coalesced into not an advisory board, but really a voice that had active participation in commenting on how development would or would not proceed. So it had real, I guess you'd call informal power. It exists today. It's changed its name from Village Voice to Arctic One, which advises on development in the Arctic to this day, and has a broad representation from the people of the Arctic. So thank you for letting me tell that story.
Thank you for telling the story, Terzah. That's fantastic. What a great addition to the start that Darren and his team have provided. And now I want to hand it over to Diane to share more stories.
So in listening, I changed my mind on what I was going to talk about.
That's exciting too.
Yeah. And the first thing I should say, which I didn't say earlier, is that I am a settler on the lands of the Eklutna Dena'ina people in Anchorage. So I've been there for 18 years, and my start was actually doing schools research down in Southeast. As I was developing this question, I've been yelling about the lack of attention to education in so much of the Arctic world that for those of you who are familiar with IARPIC, the Interagency Arctic Research Planning Committee, when they do their 5-year Arctic plans and education's nowhere there. And I said to Martin Jeffries, who's around these parts of the world right now, where's education? And he says, oh, we don't do education, we do research. Well, I'm an education researcher. So that got me thinking about how do I describe the role of education? So it really became, it's not education, it's knowledge and the ways we share knowledge to move forward. The first trip I went on, it also turned out that there was a deacon retiring who was one of the most respected elders in the community. We had a brief meeting and then I spent 4 hours cutting frozen caribou meat. And through that process, getting to know, first of all, some elders who were cooking for the whole village. But of course, I'm cutting the meat, and when the elder cooks it and hands it to me, I'm going to eat it. And not only that, I enjoyed it, really did. That was the power of humor, that people could laugh at me, in part, through, there's pictures of Charlene, with chainsaw and, trying to figure out how to cut the big things into smaller pieces. And also just the sense that the relationship building that happens is more important than, again, the funding cycle. And we didn't know that, 3 months later, we'd be sitting, not going anywhere and not returning to that community for 1.5 years. But there's still people who remember I would cut meat, and also just the sense that, oh, you'll come back.
Okay, thank you, Diane. I just wanted to say maybe one thing, and that it just feels like there's some themes that are kind of running through all of our speakers. Things like humor, obviously relationship building, but the sense of time and how that fits into the work that we're doing. Developing shared understandings of the project, which is something that I talk about a lot in the work that I do with teams all over the country. How do you develop a shared understanding of whatever that team is that's coming together around the table? And then, of course, the theme that the New England Arctic Network has proposed to us, this idea of the power of stories. And I love that Brene Brown quote. That was wonderful. So I do want to open it up to questions, and I want to just kind of acknowledge that we have people in the room here who are going to ask questions, but we also have questions that are going to come to the back through chat. So if you are online, please feel free to offer questions. And so let me just open it up to people for questions. I have some of my own too, but I'd love to hear. Jack.
This idea of, a long time and your village voice example of having the village come together and decide, what it was that they wanted and how to proceed, it's not clear that there is one village voice. And I guess a couple of examples is, like in 2015, I was at a conference in Greenland, and it was a climate conference run by Greenlandics, and they were super excited about a new deal they set in place with Denmark, and they were having big oil lease sales. And they were thinking that this was the salvation of their country, that now they were getting away from Denmark and they're gonna be an oil king. And last year, a new government came in and has slowed way down. And another example sort of is, at the end of the Trump administration, there were the lease sales in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And it seemed like different villages and different people within the villages on the North Slope were extremely divided about whether this was good or bad. But your example is like, well, we really need to find what the village wants. But is that realistic? Do they all want the same thing? And do they want that forever? And I don't think the answer to either one of those can be yes.
Terzah, okay. Good.
Yeah, so exactly. There is not one answer. There is not one unified Indigenous voice. That would be sort of odd. The Royal Dutch Shell Project, which I headed, spearheaded, but actually harpoon headed. I was at the pointy end of the harpoon on that one. In the Arctic Ocean, there was not agreement. That is exactly why Village Voice was born. These leases were sold. We have a big, powerful oil company who wants to go drill in our backyard, where we get 50% of our food. I'll just say that again, not from the store, because we couldn't afford that. And we needed to figure out how to interject ourselves in something that had already been done, and how to do that effectively. And not with a unified voice on a position. We never stood up and said, this is our position. It was, okay, so how is this development going to proceed? So I know that's a complex answer because there is no singular voice. I would be very suspect if anybody stands up and says, this is how all people feel here, or that's another red flag. There are going to be lots of shades of gray.
I thank you. That was a great start to probably a conversation that we could have for many days. But I see Darren has unmuted. So Darren, did you want to add to that?
I think I frame these things up as due diligence or commitments to process. A more extractive approach is to be like, okay, what's their perspective? And we'll put it into our little hopper of what we need to know or do. And I think being a guest means that you presume that there is a variety, and that's actually your challenge. And to be open to that there isn't, in terms of what you want out of a situation might not even be possible. Imagine how complicated it is to be like, if someone were to be like, what do you mean not all scholars agree? Not all university people agree, and I can't locate that. And
so Darren, thank you for continuing to weave the theme of humor into the workshop. You're engaging everybody here. I want to go to a question online. So
perfect. Cameron would like to know if any of the panelists can elaborate on the difference between co-creation and co-production. And Terzah actually started in the chat with that a little bit more. So maybe elaborate a little bit on that.
Co-creation means working with the people of the region and understanding their interests. So are they interested in what you're interested in? Coming to that, let's co-create the research, right? The research question. How do you know what to ask if you don't work with the people first? Sometimes it feels like we leap immediately to co-production. Now we're going to produce something together. Let's go make that widget, whatever it is, a piece of research, a barrel of oil, an environmental policy. I'm putting everybody at the same trough here. So co-creation in direct response to Cameron's is that step prior to co-production.
I think academics think of themselves as like, being on the side of God or being the good guys. And so much of our work and our institutions are implicated in horrible colonial practice and even more recent screw ups. And that's the story I wanted to share. So Jan, Angie.
Well, I think Indigenous people all over the world have, because of colonialism, has a mistrust embedded in us, but we still remain to sit at the table when asked. I think the biggest thing in the past is that we've been asked to the table when the train's already leaving the station. So we have to hurry up and catch the train. I'm hoping that these relationship buildings will give us plenty of time to get on the train and get relaxed and be ready to have the meeting and not just hurry up and get on the train. And that's what I feel. It's like, hurry up, keep us busy in running so that we don't have time to actually think about what they're proposing. And so that's Native people in general, they could take days to make up a decision. And the thing is no people, I don't care who they are going to see eye to eye 100%. But they still need to be asked, no matter what village is on the river, on the land that's in the backyard, you still have to have the conversation with the village. They have to have input.
Thank you. And thank you, Darren, for jumping in and prompting that element of our conversation. Great. We have a couple of minutes left, and Bridie, I want to pick on you for a minute, since I've had I've really appreciated my conversations with you over the years. Are there things that we should be teaching our graduate students and undergraduates right now to prepare for doing this work.
I got the first part of the question. It's reflecting on graduate student experiences and training. And I'm really appreciative of this question, in part because I saw the question in the chat, and I think that's a really important one. And it also ties together some of what we've been talking about. And Jan, what Jan was mentioning in terms of these temporal pressures that we have of like, you show up and the train has already left the station because, if it's a grant funded project, you have NSF, requiring that you need to demonstrate progress as quickly as possible. So much of this is about time, and what Jan was speaking to of just like feeling these pressures of needing to produce. And then these pressures are amplified when you have students who are on timelines, right? That they have a thesis or a dissertation, and they need to finish that up within a specified window. And Angie, I think if I'm thinking of the same meeting, I actually think the difficulty we were facing was around a lack of awareness about that kind of pressure and the student who needed to be able to defend the dissertation. And so I think in part, we need to shift those kinds of norms. Yes, we need graduate student training and developing skills around reflexivity and co-creation. I appreciate that modification of co-production. But we also need to change the norms of how we're evaluating academic progress and success, and really proliferate the different options that students have for demonstrating the ability to do this work that goes well beyond a thesis or a dissertation, and that would account for these forms of relationality, right? And the amazing amount of effort that goes into that, and humility and kindness and friendship and all these other heart-based values, to go back to something that Jan was saying.
I just want to add, Bridie, that I really appreciate that. And I want to share with folks that, I don't know if the people are still in the room, but for folks online, I feel like the fact that some of your students from the first class that we did so much work with are still in touch with some of us for job references or just sending us information, that needs to be valued somehow. They weren't graduate students, but nonetheless, I really feel like that has been the epitome of relationship building. So I appreciate you sharing that.
Hey, I guess we're having this conversation online. If I could just sort of add a question to that is, we're thinking about how we might change graduate student education to allow for this. So it's not all about sort of, Terzah, coming back to your point, production, right? Which is what graduate school is about so much for so many students. And I'm wondering if there's some great examples out there where higher education values these, what you might call sort of these softer skills as part of a graduate education, instead of the sort of the publications or the data analysis or the graphs.
A couple things that I could point to. UMaine right now has a number of national research traineeships that I think are really trying to push on this and provide some examples, especially in the emphasis in developing partnerships with conservation organizations, including the Penobscot Nation. And then, Darren, I'm also thinking about Suzanne Greenlaw's work and how, the kind of work that she's doing on emerald ash borer and basket making is another kind of model too. And those are ones closer to home, but if others have other examples.
I might just add that I think the whole purpose of the Navigating the UArctic Community Office, which is targeted at those grants, but it's NSF recognizing that we need to be providing those structures. But the other side, a grant that didn't get funded, and I think we need to re-put this in, which was across a bunch of our networks, is communities also need support. Communities need support in knowing how to say no. The Canadian communities do a much better job of saying no when it needs to be said. And actually, I think in the lower 48, there are some tribes that, hey, if you're not ready for us to come in there, we should not have the right to come in. And that is not the attitude amongst many researchers, certainly in Alaska.
And we heard this, just to close this out, I heard that message over and over again when I was at COP, that, the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the role of sacred data and sacred knowledge. And to get to that place where someone might offer that sacred data and sacred knowledge is a much longer process, as we've heard today. This has been awesome. This is a continuing conversation. So you'll see that after we take a quick break, we're going to come back and really talk about, I'll help moderate a discussion on what changes do we need to see In education, what are some of the things we would like to do? How might NEAN help affect some of that?